Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on deploying and maintaining server images. Now I will tell you, when it comes to Windows Server 2012, you want to talk about deploying images. It's all about something called the Windows Deployment Services, or simply WDS. So what is WDS? Well, if you have worked with Windows Server 2003, or even back with Windows 2000, we had something called Remote Installation Services, or RIS. With the release of Windows Server 2008, RIS got updated and redesigned and was then called Windows Deployment Services. And we still have those same Windows Deployment Services in Windows Server 2012. So if you worked with Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 and you are familiar with RIS, then I will tell you that you should be, for the most part, familiar with WDS, at least from a concept perspective. Whereas if you've worked with Windows Server 2008 and WDS, well, then you pretty much already get it across the board. Because other than maybe a few small tweaks, it's essentially the same role. Now, speaking of role, it should be noted that Windows Deployment Services is a server role that is included with Windows Server 2012. Okay, so there's nothing special you have to do in the way of downloads or anything like that. It's already included. And as I pretty much started off saying, Windows Deployment Services is used to deploy Windows images. Right? So you take your Windows operating systems, right? You take images of them, and you deploy those out typically onto a bare metal computer. So a computer that has a blank hard drive, has nothing on it. Now, if we take a look at the components of WDS, we have our servers, which are used to store and deploy the images, and then of course our clients, which, well, receive the images. And the way they receive the images is across the network using something called PXE, or PXE, which stands for Pre-Execution Environment. To simplify what PXE means, it means that the computer, if it can PXE boot, that's a term that you'll hear very often, if you can PXE boot, or do you want to PXE boot, it means that you don't need to have any boot files on the local system itself. Okay, on that physical computer, you don't have to have anything in the hard drive, you don't have to have a CD or DVD, you don't have to have a USB drive, you don't have to have anything. What it does is it automatically goes across the network, connects with a WDS server, and boots that way, and then receives its image. And then of course once it receives the image, well, now it has an operating system and it can boot and function properly. Now, it should also be noted that WDS can be used to deploy both client and server operating systems. Okay, so you can use this to deploy a bunch of client machines, but you could also use it to deploy a bunch of servers. Now, if you think about it, what are you going to most likely use it for? Probably for your client operating systems more so than your servers, because, well, in any given network, you're going to have one server for every 100 clients, every 200, every 500. Now, I know there are some smaller networks where you have one server for every 10 clients. There is no magical number, but typically the idea is you have many more clients out there than you do servers. Also, each server on your network typically is going to be configured independent of all other servers. Only once you get to the large enterprise do you have large quantities of servers that are going to be similar and therefore can be imaged and redeployed. Now, I will tell you that this can deploy clients going all the way back to Windows XP. So you can deploy XP, Vista, Windows 7, or Windows 8. And on the server side, you can deploy going all the way back to Windows Server 2003. So 2003, 2008, and of course the R2 editions as well, and then Windows Server 2012. These are the operating systems that can be deployed using WDS. Now, what I'd like to do is I want to jump over and show you how to install and configure Windows Deployment Services. But real quick before we do, there are some things we need to make sure we have in place before we install WDS. We need to make sure that we have Active Directory Domain Services running on our network. We need to make sure that we have DNS up and running on the network, which typically if you're going to have ADDS, well then you're also going to have DNS because it's a supporting role for that. We need to have DHCP, and there's a little side note that I need to point out about DHCP, and that is if the DHCP server role is going to be on the same computer as the WDS role, okay, if it's those two roles are going to be on the same box, then you need to do what's called prevent the PXE server, which is a component of the server side of things, from listening on UDP port 67, because that port is used by DHCP. And there is a checkbox to make that happen. We'll take a look at that when we get into the actual operating environment. And then you also need to then have DHCP option 60. Now, we don't cover DHCP in this course, but if you watched our 70-410 installing and configuring Windows Server 2012, if you saw that course, or also I believe in the 70-412, which is the Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course, in either of those two courses, we do talk about DHCP options. So if you're not familiar with what that term means, go find that lesson in one of those courses. But DHCP option 60 needs to be configured out to the client, which enables the PXE client to locate the WDS server port, being that it's not using UDP port 67 because we disabled that for DHCP. Now, before you get all flustered and say, whoa, you completely lost me, because I get it. I'm sure I did lose you. I know I would be lost right now. The first time I read that, I'm like, I don't know what that means. I need to go in and look at it. We will look at some of this. But I want to point out that part of why I'm just kind of throwing it out there right now is because you having to do this, the likeliness of it is slim to none. It's not very typical at all. And the reason why is because the only scenario where you have to do this is not just when the two coexist. These steps have to happen if the two services are going to coexist, right? So if you're going to have DHCP and WDS on the same machine, it has to happen. But here's the deal. If the server is a DHCP server first, which it should be because I just told you DHCP should be in place before WDS. So if that server is a DHCP server first, then when you install WDS onto that server, this stuff happens for you automatically. All right? It's not something you have to go do. It happens as part of the installation process. The only time you would ever have to manually do these steps is if you were already a WDS server and you then, for whatever reason, decide to make it into a DHCP server. And sure, anything's possible, but it's not likely. Now, there's one last component you need, and this is kind of an easy one, and that is you have to have an NTFS formatted volume for the storage of your images. The reason I say it's pretty easy is because in today's day and age, almost everything by default is NTFS formatted. This prerequisite has been listed going all the way back to the days of remote installation services, or RIS. Because back then, it was not uncommon at all to have a FAT formatted partition. These days, it's still possible to format a partition with the FAT filing system, but it's not common. Okay, but it is technically a prerequisite. All right, well, that's enough talking about all of this. Let's go ahead and jump over to the actual operating environment, and well, heck, let's get this stuff installed and configured and see how it all works. Okay, so here we are inside a Windows Server 2012 computer, and actually before we really get into this, I'd like to just kind of explain how my environment is set up, and then also explain what you would need to do if you want to follow along. First of all, my environment has 3 servers currently running. Okay, and actually I'll tell you what, I'm going to minimize the one that we're looking at right now so I can show you all 3 of them. If I were to go into a server that I have called NYDC1, I will tell you that this is a Windows Server 2012 computer. That if I jump over here into Server Manager, you will see that I have this one set up as a domain controller. Okay, this was actually the first computer that I set up in my network. Okay, this is an Active Directory domain services domain controller for the globalmantics.local domain. Okay, so the GlobalMantics Corporation corporate headquarters are in New York. Okay, so we're starting everything off there with NYDC1. This server is not only a domain controller, but it's also a DNS server, and it's also our DHCP server. So as you can see, the prerequisites for WDS all exist here on this one server. But if I minimize this server, I will show you that I have a second server running, and I would say the second one is not nearly as vital to what we're trying to accomplish right now. But basically it's NYDC2, and again, if I jump over to Server Manager, you'll see here that it's also a domain controller with Active Directory Domain Services and a DNS server for the globalmantics.local domain. Okay, so basically this server is just acting as a backup to the first one. And then the third server I have running is the one that we're going to use primarily in this lesson. This server is named NYMEM1. Okay, and so again, this server is supposed to be in the New York office. It's a Windows Server 2012 computer that has been joined to the globalmantics.local domain. So it's not a domain controller, it's simply a member server. Now, in order to install Windows Deployment Services, we need to go to the place where we would install any other server role, and that is the Server Manager. So coming down here onto the taskbar, there's an icon for Server Manager. Go ahead and click on that. As you can see, I already had it opened. I just had it minimized. So if you're following along, it might take you a moment here for the Server Manager to open all the way up. But in this particular utility, and this is the utility, by the way, where you manage almost everything in Windows Server 2012. But in this utility, we have a link here for Add Roles and Features. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that now so we can add the role. And here we get our Add Roles and Features wizard. So we can choose to do a role-based or feature-based installation, and that's what we want to do. It's a role-based installation. Click Next. We then have to decide what server we're going to go ahead and add the role to, and we do want to add it to NYMEM1, so I'll just go ahead and click Next. And now we get to determine what role it is we want to add. And so if I scroll down, since these are alphabetical, you'll see here near the bottom we have Windows Deployment Services. So I will check that box. And when I do, as we've seen with pretty much any role, with most of the roles that we're installing, if there are any additional features or other role services that need to be installed in order to support this installation, it pops up and lets us know. And typically, other than looking at what it's installing, I pretty much just go ahead and say, yeah, add the features, do it for me. This is a really nice feature in Windows Server 2012 that rather than just airing out and say, well, you can't install this unless you have something else first. Nope. Server will tell you, hey, we need to add something else, and I'm going to do it for you. So I'm going to go ahead and say add those features, and then we click Next. There are no additional features that I need to install, so I'll click Next again. And at this point, it's now explaining to us what exactly WDS is, and then it's also telling us to note certain things that are going to need to be in place in order for this all to work. This is the stuff that we were just talking about before we came into the operating system. So I'll click Next. Now, this is something that is a little bit new. Okay, we didn't see this previously in the original Windows Server 2008 version of this. But basically, this role is divided into two different services. We have the deployment server and the transport server. The deployment server, it says right here, provides the full functionality of WDS, which you can use to configure and remotely install Windows operating systems. With WDS, you can create and customize images and then use them to re-image other computers. The deployment server is dependent on the core parts of the transport server. So in other words, you have to have both parts. The deal is that you can now split these parts into two different physical servers if you want to. Now, what is the transport server? You'll see here that it's a subset of the functionality of WDS. It contains only the core networking parts, which are used to transmit the data using multicasting on a standalone server. Okay, so keep in mind, multicasting is one of the nice features that we now have with WDS. You should use this role service if you want to transmit data using multicasting, but do not want to incorporate all of the Windows deployment services. All right, so if you just want to have a server acting as just the core role of basically being your multicast server, the server that would, I don't want to say broadcast because that could confuse it, but I was going to say broadcast the multicast transmission. Broadcast not from a technological term, but more from just a layman's, you think of a broadcast. It's being sent out on the airways for anybody who wants to receive it. And that's kind of how the multicast works. So now in this particular instance, we're going to go ahead and have all the functionality built right into this one server. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Next. And here we just get a final confirmation. So I'm going to go ahead and click Install, and it will begin the installation process. Now, depending on the speed of the computer that you're using, this may take a longer or shorter period of time than mine is going to take here. I know mine will take a few minutes, but what I'm going to do here is, through the magic of video editing, I'm going to speed up this process, and then we'll just go ahead and continue as soon as this installation process has completed. All right, so my process has completed, but you'll notice I have the little warning box here, and it says that there's a restart pending on this particular machine, so you have to restart it in order to finish this installation. So I will go ahead and close this window, restart the server, and I'm going to actually pause the recording of this lesson, and I'll be right back with you as soon as we have rebooted and we're back up into the system. And if you are following along, then you make sure you go ahead and pause this lesson as well, and then we can all continue together in just a moment. Okay, the system has rebooted and I've just logged back in. So this will take just a moment because when you first log in, Server Manager will open by default, but it takes a moment for the services to start up and Server Manager to be up and running. I do want to mention, by the way, I am logged in as the Global Mantix Administrator, and that is significant only in the sense that you need to understand that in order to install this role, you have to have administrative privileges. That technically is one additional prerequisite that is listed besides the need for Active Directory domain services and DNS and DHCP and an NTFS volume. There is one more prerequisite, and that is that you have to have those administrative privileges in order to install the role. I didn't mention it earlier because that's kind of assumed, right? If you're going to install any role. Now, I don't want you to worry about the fact that right here I have these red boxes showing up and the 3 next to services. Basically, when you first boot a system in Windows Server 2012, this is not uncommon at all. Certain services have a delayed start, and as a result, right now the system's saying, hey, you know what? I see that there's some services that should be running, but they're not, so I'm going to give you a little red color that shows up because that seems to alert people that there's a problem when they see red. But basically, in a few minutes we wait this out, those services will begin. So that's nothing I want you to worry about that you're seeing here, nor is it anything that I want you to worry about if you were following along and you see this happen on your system as well. And as a matter of fact, let's go ahead and I'll hit refresh up here. And sometimes, look at that, as quickly as just a couple minutes into the booting of the system, everything cleans up. So now everything is up and running. It is something that I do like to do on my servers, make sure that you see that go away. But anyway, you'll notice that we now have Windows deployment services, right? We see that over here as well. And I will tell you that even though we have installed Windows deployment services, it is not complete until we go in and configure the Windows deployment services server. So what I want to do is come over here to the Tools menu, and you'll notice that we now have Windows Deployment Services. Here in the Windows Deployment Services utility, I'm going to expand servers, and you'll see that I have NYMEM1. But it has that little warning on it, right? So I'm going to highlight it, and you'll see here it says it's not configured. To configure it, right-click and say Configure Server. And you have to be an administrator, right? I just mentioned that that was a prerequisite. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click and say I want to configure my server. Again, it's warning me about the prerequisites that must be in place. Click Next. This is where I can say I'm going to integrate it with Active Directory, or I could make it a standalone where it works independently of Active Directory, not something that is typically used or recommended. So we're going to go ahead and integrate with Active Directory. We need to decide where we would like to put our images, right? We're going to store these images and put them out there for clients, and it must be on an NTFS formatted volume. Now this particular computer only has one volume. Okay, if I were to go ahead and hit my Start button to get me into the Start menu, and then I click Computer, you will see here that I really only have the one hard drive. Okay, it's my 1C drive. It's about 200 gig. That's all I have, but it is NTFS. So I'm just going to go ahead and say on my C drive, let's put it in the remote install directory. That's the default location that it will put it, and that's the default name of the directory as well. So I'm going to click Next, and you get a little warning saying, hey, you do realize you're about to put these images on your system volume, which means there could be some performance issues if there's like a heavy load on these images, which is why you typically would probably want to install an additional hard drive, create an additional volume on that separate hard drive so that you can separate it from the operating system needs. But because I only have the one and this is just demonstration, I'm going to say, yeah, I know what I'm doing. So yes, go ahead and do it, even though there could be some performance issues. Now is where I get to decide, well, how do I want this server to respond to clients right now at this point? The default is do not respond to any client computers. What we're saying is don't respond yet. Right? You might be thinking, well, why the heck would you set this up but not respond to any clients? You may not want the clients that are out there who may be pixie booting to connect with this server while we're in the middle of setting it up. So you may, by default, say, no, don't respond yet. When I'm done configuring it, I will change this setting. And I will show you how we do that. You could say respond only to known client computers. Okay, and this would be only computers that we are already aware of. So in other words, computers that already have an account in Active Directory. This is what's sometimes known as pre-staging the computer accounts. Okay, so you go ahead and create the computer account in Active Directory. But in order to do this, you would have to know the global unique identifier of that computer so that the correct computer gets the right computer name and our Windows Deployment Services knows about it. We could say just respond to everything. Respond to the clients that already have an account in Active Directory or any computers that don't have an account in Active Directory. Just respond to everybody. And if they don't have a computer account in Active Directory, well, then there's a naming convention that we can put in place to go ahead and say, this is the name I'm going to throw out to that particular computer that didn't have a name and didn't exist in Active Directory if they're being deployed with this WDS server. Now, we could choose to require administrator approval for these unknown computers. Basically, what will happen is there's a pending nodes or pending devices node in this particular utility, and that's where they will go, and then an administrator would have to say, yes, okay, deploy, if we were to do that. Now, for right now, I'm going to say, no, don't respond to anything, because we're still in the middle of configuring. Click Next, and it's going to go through here and do the things that are necessary and go through and enable various servers, enable various services, go ahead and create certain folder structures, and so on and so forth. Now it tells me that I have successfully configured WDS, and by default it's saying, the next thing you need to do is add some images, right? You're configured, but you need to add some images. So I'm going to go ahead and actually not add them right now, and I'm going to finish this wizard so that you can see that we no longer have that little warning box. We now have the little green, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little green triangle there saying everything is running. And we also have a structure now where we have install images. This is where we'll put the actual operating system images. We have our boot images. These are the images that actually will allow the remote clients to boot from this Windows Deployment Services server. Here's that pending devices node that we were talking about, where if there were any that were in here waiting for our approval, we'd see them here. Multicast transmissions, which is new to Windows Server 2012 in the sense that we now can go ahead and create a multicast transmission of an image. So this is kind of cool. Multicast is a great way to save on bandwidth. It basically means I can deploy the image out once and be received by many. And this is a big deal because I can tell you I went in, back in the days of Windows 2000, I went into an office where I needed to deploy 80 computers all at once. And actually, to be more specific, we had 45 computers that were all in one room that we could get to really, really fast and start them all at the same time. So just to test it, now this was back on a 100 megabit Ethernet network. We went ahead and had the images queued up on the Remote Installation Services server, and we ran up and down the aisles as fast as we could and started all 45 clients trying to receive a simple Windows 2000 image. What happened was because we had 45 separate instances of that image trying to be pushed out onto this network all at the same time. Believe it or not, only 5 of the 45 clients were even somewhat successful in getting that image. 40 of them just crapped out and said, nope, sorry, can't even access the server. The image has died. I don't know what's going on, but we're done. And of the 5 that were able to get the image, one of them was corrupt. When we went to reboot, when we were all said and done, one of the images was no good. So out of 45 computers, only 4 actually got the image. That's not real good. Well, with multicast, that same scenario would have worked. What would have happened is we would have gone ahead and the server would have sent the image down once, right? It's only going to broadcast it out, or I won't use the term broadcast because that's a different technological term, but it transmitted the image out once, and it would then just simply be received by all 45 computers in the same transmission. And that would have worked just fine, and all 45 machines most likely would have got their image. Now we also have a drivers node here, and this is where if we need to have any special custom drivers that we need to get in to these images and out to these clients, we can manage those here. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and show you how to create a boot image. I'm going to right click on the boot images and select add boot image, and then it wants to know, well, where's this image that you want to add? Now typically it tells you right here, you can find it, right? You have boot.wim and install.wim on the installation DVD in your sources folder. So I happen to have my Windows Server 2012 DVD still in the drive, so I'm going to browse to my computer and then to my D drive, and in the sources directory here's my 2 WIM files, okay, my Windows installation media files. So boot.wim is what we want for our boot image, so I'll open that, I'll click next, and then I can give it a name. So I could say boot image, and we'll go ahead and give it the same description, right? Boot image. I'll click next, next, and it's adding the image. Now this process, again, go faster or slower depending on the size of the image, what operating system you're using, and the speed of the server that you're working on. As you can see, no magic here, just the amount of time that I've been talking. Mine is complete. If yours is not, go ahead and pause and then resume when yours is complete. But I'm going to go ahead and click on finish. And I now have a boot image. Next, you have to create an install image, right? You need an image of the actual operating system. So I will right click and select to add an install image. From there, you'll see here that it wants to create an image group, right? An image group is a collection of images that share common file resources and security. Now, I'm going to cancel out of here because I want to show you something. Yes, I'm sure I want to stop adding an image. If I would have right-clicked, I could have selected an image group first, and the image group I could create, we'll say Windows Server 2012. Now I could have also done that right in the original wizard when I was installing the images, right? So again, on install images, I'll right click and say add install image. I could have selected an image group this way, or I could have created an image group right now as I'm doing it. I just want to show you there's multiple ways to do this. I will also show you that you could select, right, go to the specific image group and say add install image, and it will skip that page. It knows what image group you want to add it to because, well, you selected it. So we will go ahead and we need to now add the WIM file. So again, notice it's pointing you know, just recommending that same folder that you go to the DVD and go to the sources folder. So let's browse there. I'm already in that location because it remembers it from last time. So here's install.wim. Click open and next, and watch what happens. You'll notice that this particular image that's on the Windows Server 2012 DVD that I have here. Well, let's take a look at what we have here. Well, we need to go even further here. I have Server Standard Core, Server Standard. That would be the GUI version of Standard Edition. We have Data Center Core and Data Center. We could actually have all four of these images load in as part of this server group if we want to. Or if we know, for instance, we're not going to do Data Center, I could clear those checkboxes. Heck, maybe I know I'm not going to do Server Core, I'm just going to do Standard Edition, right? Just one edition I know I want to do. I'll just select that one box. Now you can use the default name and description for each of the selected images, which means, of course, it's going to be this. Or if I clear that box, when I click Next, it'll ask me to name it. So I want to rename this. I'm going to take this Server Standard, and I'm just going to call it Standard with GUI. I'm going to give it the same description here. Standard with GUI. Click Next. And summary, so I'll click Next again. And once again, it is adding the window images. Now, in this case, really, it said images, right? Because what it says here, it's really one image because I cleared all the checkboxes except for one. Now, I will tell you that this process will take just a little bit longer than the boot image, because the boot image was nothing more than basically Windows PE, right? Just going ahead and just that pre-execution environment, that's much smaller image. Then this is a full-blown Windows Server 2012 image. Okay, so this process is going to take a little while. So again, through the magic of video editing, I will speed this process up. And if you are following along, then please go ahead and pause the lesson and resume once this process has completed. Okay, so it says the operation is complete. The selected images were successfully added to the server. If I click Finish, you will see that we now have an image here inside of our Windows Server 2012 image group called Windows Server 2012 Standard with GUI. Now at this point, we are ready to go ahead and be able to deploy this image out to our clients. But there is a problem. And the problem is that you might recall I said don't respond to any clients. So I need to jump over here to my server, and I'm going to right click and go to the server's properties. Here on the property sheet, here we have our Pixie Response tab, and this is where we can go ahead and we can change that. We can go ahead and say, all right, well, we're all set up, so respond to known client computers. Now that would be, you know, if we had already in Active Directory had pre-staged or pre-created the computer accounts for these clients. Or we could just go ahead and say respond to everybody. Now there's an issue if we're going to respond to everybody, and that is if it's somebody who does not have a computer account in Active Directory yet, what is that computer going to be named and where's that computer account going to go? So let's take a look at some of the rest of the tabs that we have here on our property sheet. If I go to the ADDS tab, you'll see here that we have a client naming policy. And you'll see that it's going to have a format. And the format is basically to use a username followed by a number, a sequential number. Okay, so the user, the computer is basically going to be named what the username is plus a number. Now, we can change that. Okay, you can go ahead and you can put in, I don't know, some people like to go ahead and just actually have a naming convention, so the actual name that they want all of their clients to be called. So maybe the name will be a literal, well, in this case, it's Windows Server 2012. So maybe the naming convention is, if I know this is all for the New York office and these are going to be member servers, maybe it's new ny-mem- and then a sequential number. So the first guy would be nymem1, the next one would be nymem2, and so on and so forth. Now, as far as the computer account location, like where's that computer account can be created in Active Directory, in the same domain where WDS is. That's very typical, right? Working within this domain. Could be the same domain as the user who's actually logging in to perform the installation. Could be in the same organizational unit as that user, or a very specific location. Okay, there is no rule there. It's based upon whatever it is that you're looking for. Now, another specific item I want to point out to you is on the DHCP tab. This is where you can do the checkbox that says do not listen on the DHCP ports, right? When we were talking about disabling the Pixie server from listening on UDP port 67. Okay, that would be here. And then the checkbox here that says configure the DHCP options to indicate that this is also a Pixie server. That's doing that option 60 that I talked about. So it's as simple as some checkboxes, but at the same time, you're not going to have to do it unless you were to make this a DHCP server after installing WDS. All right, let's go ahead and get out of these property sheets here. And I just want to show you something real quick. I want to jump out of this particular server. Okay, so we're going to minimize New York Mem 1 for just a moment, and we're going to go away from the WDS server. And I'm going to go into my Hyper-V utility, where I have a virtual machine set up for a brand new client. And we're going to boot that client, and then you can see how the Pixie boot actually works. And I will tell you going in, the screen sizes kind of jump around here, so I'll do my best to make this look nice and pretty for you. But basically here in Hyper-V, I have this WDS client. It's off right now. Okay, so you can see this machine is off. I'm going to start it, and then I'm going to jump into a full screen mode, and hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to see. And then I want you to watch carefully what's going to take place. And I'm kind of telling you this before I do it because things tend to move quickly. But basically it's going to go in, and this machine has been configured to do a network boot. So it's going to go out to DHCP, look for an IP address. Once it does, it's going to tell me to press F12 for network boot. I will hit that F12 button, and it should take me into the WDS server. So let's try this. So we start the machine, you jump to full screen, there you go. And you see it's out there. It's trying to hit DHCP, which I should have up and running. Everything should be fine. Should get an IP address. And actually, usually it would have done it by now, and it's not. So let me go make sure I have everything configured. Because actually, I think I know why it's not responding. And this is a common mistake people make, so I'd like to show you this. Let me go ahead and I'm going to actually close this. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to actually turn off that client. All right, so let's just turn that off. Let's jump back over to our WDS server. I think when I was in the property sheet, yeah, you know what? When I left this property sheet, I hit cancel. You got to make sure that if you make changes that you click OK. So I'm going to say respond to all client computers. We didn't make any other changes. We left all the other defaults. And you know what? Just to make sure, I'm going to click apply. Shouldn't have had to do that. But I like to do that, hit apply, and then OK. That way I know it's been done. So let me go ahead and at this point, jump back over to Hyper-V, open up that client machine. This time we'll start it, jump into full screen, connecting with DHCP, and boom, that's what I want to see. It says F12, so I'm going to press F12. Kind of have to talk and act fast here because up to that point with the whole F12 thing, you only get a few seconds, and if you miss it, it says boom. Apparently you didn't want network boot off of the WDS server, so we'll just forget it. But you'll notice at this point, it's now loading the files from boot.wim, right? So it's the Windows PE that is loading right? So this is going to be a very basic, very minimal version of Windows, basically specifically for Windows installation, what we're looking at right here. And this will be done in just a moment. You can see it's actually beginning to load now into Windows PE. Setup is starting. And again, you see this is just a little bit different than your normal setup because it says Windows Deployment Services, but you still go through the process, right? Next, I need to have permissions, right? It says enter your username in the forest domain user. In other words, you have to go ahead and put in your credentials. So we're going to go ahead and say for the Globomatics administrator, if I could type, there we go. Put in my password. Click OK. It now gives me the option of Windows images that are available on this Windows Deployment Services server to deploy out to this system. And you'll see here, we have Windows Server 2012 Standard with GUI. See, I intentionally named it that way instead of using the standard naming so that you can understand it's the image that I actually created, that I put on here. Now, I'm going to actually just kind of stop this right here. We don't need to go through a whole installation, but I think you're getting the idea that this is a way that you can deploy an operating system. Now, I will also tell you that you could create unattended answer files so that instead of it being a user-based, clicking through next, 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 finish type installation, it would do everything for you. But let me go ahead and let's close out of here. And let's jump back over to our Windows Deployment Services server because I'd like to show you a couple other things. First of all, if I go over to our actual Windows image, right? We have our Windows Server 2012 image. I could right click and I could create a multicast transmission. Okay, so I can put in Windows Server 2012 multicast just to give it a name. Click on next. Here we can either do autocast, which means it'll start the transmission automatically once a client has sent a request. What's interesting is as other clients come aboard, if you do this autocast thing, if you picture it as, I said the image would be transmitted once but received by many. Imagine that one client makes the request, and with autocast we say, sure, here you go, let's start deploying it to you. And then I get about 25% the way through deploying that image down to the client, and another client has come on and says, hey, I also want the image. What happens is those other clients, as they come in, will be joined to this transmission that has already started, but because they didn't get the beginning, the server will then, when the image is done being deployed, it will actually deploy it out again. Okay, and it will actually just keep repeating the sending out of this image until there's no clients that are still waiting for any piece of the image. Now, if you want to avoid that, let's take that scenario that I gave you where I knew I had the 80 clients that I had to deploy to, or I told you there were 45 that were all sitting in one room, and maybe I want to get them all out to that room at the same time. I could then do a scheduled cast, and I could say start when the number of clients that have requested this image is, and then go ahead and put in the amount. I go ahead and say, all right, when 45 clients have all queued up and said, I'm ready for this image, boom, send it out. Now it's one transmission and all 45 will receive. Okay. Another option you have, by the way, is you could also say, take a specific date and time and say at that particular date and time, that's when you're going to start transmitting. And whatever clients are connected at that point, they'll get that transmission. Okay, so this is how you can go ahead and set up the multicast transmission. Now I am going to cancel because I have no need to set this up. I just wanted to show you that that is something that you can do. Now there is one last thing that I want to go over with you before we wrap this lesson up, and that is there's a couple of special types of boot images. Okay, you see I have my default boot image here. But if I right click on that image, you'll see that I can create a discover image and I could create a capture image. Now the discover image is specific for any clients out there who are not capable of PXE booting. Now I'm going to tell you That's not real common these days. Pretty much anything and everything that you would buy in today's world can PXE boot. But if you have an older system that cannot PXE boot, then you could create this Discover image, and you could then take that image and you could put it out on a CD or a DVD or onto a USB drive or whatever that you are able to boot off of, and then it will boot off of that image to get you into the Windows PE environment if you're not able to do it truly over the network. So I will quickly click on this just to kind of show you that we can go ahead and create this. Okay, so we could call this a Discover, and actually I should have left the word boot because I'm going to call it the Discover boot image. And then we need to give it a location and file name. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to put it right on the root of the C drive. Okay. So I'm not even going to put it in my remote install directory. I'm just put it right here on the root. So right at the root, and I'm going to call it actually boot.wim because that is the name that it should be in order for it to be recognized. And then you can also tell it which WDS server that you want to go ahead and have it respond to. So I'm going to go ahead and browse there and put in nymem, tell it to check names. And it found nymem1, click OK, click next. And it's going to go ahead and extract the image from the source image file. So what it's doing is it's basically taking our boot image file that we already previously created, and it's extracting from that to create another WIM file, right? In other words, previously when we created the boot image, we took the boot.wim file that was out on the Windows Server 2012 DVD, and we created an image from it. Well, now we're doing the opposite. We're taking that image and we're creating a WIM file. And this might seem pointless. I mean, it really might, because it's like, well, why don't we just take the boot.wim that's on the DVD? And I will also tell you that the other pointlessness to this is, to some extent, why not just take the DVD, right? If you can't do a network boot, if you can't PXE boot, why not just take the DVD over to the client machine and install? Okay, and these are all valid questions. I will tell you there are some reasons for doing this, but for the most part, this is really, it's a functionality that was there to support needs that we had way back when, and we just haven't gotten rid of them in case there's still legacy hardware out there. So anyway, this will take just a few more moments, and again, depending on the speed of your system, it might even take longer. So I'll speed this up for you, and if you're following along, go ahead and pause and then resume when this process is complete. Okay, so it says the operation is complete, the image was created successfully, and you should now be able to save it to media, which is what we were just talking about. So if I click Finish, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit the Start button on my keyboard to get me into the Start screen, click on Computer, go into my C drive, right at the root you'll see there's now a boot.wim that we just created. Now the other type of special image we can create is, I think, a little bit more common than that Discover image, and that is something called a capture image. Now the idea behind this capture image is the images that we created previously were for installing just the operating system and nothing else. But what if you had a system that involved X number of business needed applications to be installed and various drivers, right? I already told you we can manually manipulate drivers, but let's say certain drivers and certain configuration settings, and we just wanted to have the machine set up in a certain way for all of our employees in a certain department. Well, the capture image is what is going to allow us to create that one perfect machine, right? You install that one machine manually, you install the operating system, all the applications, you configure it, drivers, you name it, and then you can actually capture a new image from that machine using this capture image. So I'm going to call this the capture boot image. Give it the same description. And for location and file name, again, I'll do it right on the root of the C drive, and I'm just going to call it, capture.wim. And I'll click next. And once again, it's going to, just as it did with the Discover image, it's going to extract from our original boot image and create this capture.wim file. But here's the difference. This is not something that I'm going to put out onto a piece of removable media. This is actually an image that I am, when this is done, going to import right back into the WDS server so that when the client connects, we'll be able to create a new capture image. So again, just like before, this might take a few moments, so I'm going to speed this up. If you are following along, you can hit pause and resume when this process is completed. Alright, so again, the operation is complete, the image was created successfully, and you'll see right here, it says select the checkbox to add this image to the server when the wizard closes. Yeah, see, we need to, and I know this seems a little goofy, because, right, we got the boot image that was a WIM file, and then we turned it into an image on the WDS server. And then from that image, we created another WIM file, which, I'll tell you what, before I go any further, let me hit Start, Computer, go to the C drive, and you'll see I have capture.wim, right? We created that. And now, we're going to add that image right back into the server as an actual deployable image. So I'll click Finish, and now I'm going to add the image, and it's saying, where's the WIM file? There it is. Next. Capture boot image, that's fine. We've already named it. That's fine with me. Click Next. Next. And now it's going to do the reverse. It's going to go ahead and it's going to add the image from the WIM file back here into the WDS server. And again, I know it sounds a little bit weird and redundant to go the one way and then we go the other way and then we go back and then we go forward again. But that is the process. So basically, as you can see here, it moves along much faster, right? In other words, bringing the WIM file into an image is much faster than the other way around. And that operation is already complete. So I will click Finish. And you'll see here that I now have the capture boot image. And what does that mean? All right, well, if I had an actual Windows Server 2012 computer all set and ready to go, right? It's been installed, it's got its application, it's been configured, the works. I would then do something called sysprep it. Okay, sysprep is a utility that strips out anything that is specific to that particular machine, like the machine's name, its IP address, anything that's specific to that machine. It makes it a generic image. And then when it's done, it reboots. And when it reboots, and this is the part I am going to show you, we're going to jump back over here into Hyper-V. Let's turn off this WDS client. And then let's go back into it again. Let's pretend that this is a machine that has already been created. It already has an operating system. It's been configured. When it boots, if you Pixie boot it, which is what we're going to do right here, start it, go into full screen, make it easier to see. It'll take just a moment for it to get an IP address. There it is. Press F12. This time, you'll see there's one thing that's just a little bit different. I get to now choose, is this the standard boot image or is it the capture boot image? Now I can't move forward from here in this demonstration because this is not an actual fully functional Windows Server 2012 computer. But what I can tell you is if it was, the process that would happen once I select capture boot image is that it wouldn't actually download an image from the WDS server. It would actually upload an image of itself to the WDS server. Okay, there's a little wizard to help you with this, and you give it a name and everything. And from there, let me just kind of pop back over here. Under Install Images, possibly under this particular group, again, there's a little wizard involved, you would see that additional image appear here, and then that image could then be turned around and deployed out to other machines. So that is pretty much how Windows deployment services work. So the main things that I want you to pull from this is keeping in mind that WDS is a server role. Once you've installed the role, you do have to configure the server. There's not a lot to it, but you do have to do some basic configuration. From there, you have to create at least one boot image, which would then direct you to being able to have some install images, which are the actual operating systems that you're going to deploy. You can multicast to save on bandwidth, make things much more efficient. If need be, you can do your discover images so that you can put that onto removable media if you have a computer that doesn't PXE boot. And you can do capture images so that you can have these images be fully functional images, not just the operating system. So that is all I have for you in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.